Hello and welcome to session four's question and answer period of the Power at Play Symposium. We are joined by four wonderful scholars who are here to answer questions submitted by the public. So just to get things started, I think it would be nice if everyone could introduce themselves and maybe perhaps tell us where you are and what you research. Starting with Jessica. Why don't we start with Jessica?
Hi, I'm Jessica Hammond-Graf. I'm the Deputy Athletic Director at UMBC, and I'm also a doctoral student at Frostburg State University in their higher education and leadership program. So I am a hashtag rookie researcher. So this is really my first one, and I've been diving into the process of empowerment and in sport and how it relates to women's trajectory beyond sport. So what do we need in the space, in the sporting environment, to create that process of empowerment for women to be empowered beyond?
Fantastic. Adriana, would you like to go next?
Oh yes, so hello, I'm Adriana. I'm French, but currently I live in the United States, where I teach sociology as an adjunct professor at several Californian universities. I also work as a consultant in sports industry, mainly on the issue of sports agency. I also have an extensive experience of teaching pretty much every course in social sciences. I started my teaching career in France, then I taught for 2 years in Saudi Arabia, and the last 4 years I have been based in California. So my field of study is really sports agency, everything that has to do with sports agents. And my PhD was on sports agent from the perspective of sociology of profession.
Fantastic. Kevin, why don't you go next?
Hi, yeah, I'm Kevin Witherspoon. I'm in Simpsonville, South Carolina right now, but I teach at Lander University, which is about an hour south of here in Greenwood. I wear a number of different hats on the campus and also in terms of research. Up until this past summer, I was chair of the Department of History and Philosophy, and transitioned from that. I'm now the endowed chair, the Dr. Benjamin E. Mays Endowed Chair, which is essentially a civil rights position. And in terms of my research, I focus on the Cold War era in sport. And in particular, I've tended to focus on the Olympics, although not exclusively, but that gives us a start anyway.
Wonderful. Maddie, why don't you finish this off?
Hi, I'm Maddie, and I'm in Greenwood, South Carolina, and I'm a student at Lander University. I'm one of Dr. Witherspoon's students, and we have been researching the foundations of soccer in Brazil and potential ties to Lander University. So, yep.
That is wonderful. And again, just on a more sort of introductory note, I want to say that all these presentations are fantastic. And if you're watching this right now on YouTube, you can all view every presentation in its full on our website. And I encourage you to do that. Now, and again, in the spirit of getting to know everyone more intimately here, I wanted to each of you to give a chance to discuss how you came to your current research project that you've presented here at this conference. So, Jessica, if you could tell us how you came to find this particular topic and how you came to research it.
Great question. So my background was in sports psychology, both my undergraduate and my master's degree, and grew up playing sports all through my life. My dad was in the military, so sports was the way that I made friends as a shy little girl. I wasn't going to be able to make friends without that connection. And so every 3 years I was on the new soccer team for that hometown, and it just has been a common theme throughout my life. And when I started my doctorate program, even though it's in higher education and leadership, as I was pondering what field of study, I just kept coming back to my experiences, not only in soccer, but as a rugby player and on the US women's national team, and really just thinking about my experiences and how I can make an impact professionally, also with the student athletes that I work with daily. And the notion of empowerment just kind of came to me. They always say, like, when you find that framework, it really helps shape your question. And when I came across the conceptual framework that serves as the foundation for this research, it really just put it all together. And I was like, oh yes, this is what I'm going to do. And it was just the perfect culmination of my academic background, my athletic background, and where I hope to go with it in the future.
That's wonderful, and we really we love the presentation. I encourage everyone to go have a look at that on the website as well. Adriana, why don't you go next?
In this current study, I investigate the issue of athletes protection in the context, very specific context of the tripartite athlete-agent team relationship. I conducted an initial study on this topic for the European Union Commission already 10 years ago, and that study led to significant changes in the regulation of sports agent profession. So that was more of a legal study where we really investigated how we could change the law so they can respond to the needs of athletes, but mainly soccer players. In this study, I really wanted to expand my research to other sports and mainly to American sports and athletes that practice their sport in the United States, just to try to demonstrate or to validate a hypothesis that I had from the start, which is that in the United States, the conflicts between agents and athletes are fewer simply because athletes are more involved in the regulation of athletes, of agent profession, mainly through the athletes unions. And so my findings tend to support that thesis.
Fantastic. And Kevin and Maddie, you guys can go together, and you can answer it sort of because your project, you work on it as a pair.
Yeah, Maddie is really the star of this show in terms of coming across the specific topic. So I tell you what, let me let you start, Maddie, so I don't step on your toes.
Okay. So I was taking our senior seminar course with Dr. Witherspoon, and we were doing sports in the 20th century kind of. And so I had not picked my topic yet, and I decided to go dig around in our university archives. And I came across this primary document that was a family letter. And it was the founder of our school's daughter-in-law, and she was detailing all these really wonderful experiences, talking about the Chicago's World Fair. And she and her husband had done a lot of mission work in Brazil. And she notes that they brought a soccer ball to Brazil and they taught the boys and the freedmen, like the recently freed slaves in Brazil, how to play soccer. And so we saw that the year was 1894, and we decided to look further into what year soccer was noted to be founded in Brazil. And that was the same year, but it was only known as a white urban elite sport. And so we decided to dig into that a little farther, and that's how we got started with it.
Yeah, we're Lander University is a pretty small rural institution, and we don't really have an extensive archive. So these kinds of discoveries are kind of few and far between on our campus. So I remember when Maddie came across those documents and she called me in my office. And part of me is thinking, I don't really feel like going over there, but let me go over there. So, and I'm so glad I went. Because after 3 or 4 minutes of looking at these documents, I looked at Maddie and said, you're changing your topic. We're going to work on this. And I have to say, it's been tough with the pandemic. You know, our campus, it's a little difficult to get sources and documents, even under the best circumstances. So I really commend Maddie for the effort and time she's put into this. And we're soldiering on as best we can, and hopefully this can really turn into something exciting. But it was quite a moment in our archives. We called over the head librarian and a few other people, and everybody was kind of dancing around for a few minutes there to have discovered something that noteworthy in our campus archive was really a great day.
It is. I mean, it jumped off the screen reading the presentation. I was like, this is amazing. This is absolutely amazing. It's a rare, genuine discovery. I mean, working in history, those are the kind of things you dream of, to be able to find especially a primary document. That's just amazing. So we'll get to Maddie and Kevin's presentation in a bit. I'd like to start the first question here, submitted by actually a member of our editorial board, and it says, Jessica, in your view, is this framework, the framework I believe that you developed in your presentation, particular to rugby itself, or is this applicable to other sports as well?
That's a great question. I think it's applicable to other sports as well. This was a first blush that Lemon Dixon put together to really kind of flesh out what some of those elements of an empowerment process would look like for women in sports. But going through the interviews and meeting with my participants, I don't think that it will only apply to women's rugby. I think there's ways that it can be adjusted for age groups. I think there's ways that we can be intentional, especially with like the conscious raising, like how are we being intentional about raising consciousness or awareness of women's issues with our female athletes. So I think depending on where somebody is in their pipeline of athleticism, it can really be altered to different sports. I think one of the unique things about rugby, and this is probably the same with ice hockey and women's tackle football, is you do have that element of high collision sports where you don't have that in other sports such as soccer or women's lacrosse. And so I think that adds just a different component to the empowerment process of like really showing power and strength for women in ways that they don't traditionally do. And I think that physical empowerment looks a little bit different in collision sports than it would in track and field, swimming, or tennis.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We'll move to a question here for Adriana. This is from Andy that was submitted in the chat function here. Adriana, you mentioned that the athlete has more power in the tripartite relationship in North America because of the larger union presence in North American professional sport. Do you see the power of the union strengthening or weakening in North America? And depending on your answer to that question, what effects might this have on this tripartite relationship?
I definitely think that in the United States, the power of the unions is strengthening. And well, first of all, I think it's important to mention that only very few sports have unions, and those sports would be the team sports, the what we in Europe refer to American team sports, American football, baseball, basketball, and hockey, and maybe one or two other sports. For instance, when it comes to these sports, we can definitely say, and this is something that athletes report, but also agents report that it's very difficult for them, especially European agents. They report that it's very difficult for them to negotiate contracts in the United States because they feel that the athletes have more power, whereas in Europe, the agents are really the most powerful agent within the tripartite relationship. However, there are certain sports, and I would mention track and field. The majority of professional track and field athletes are American. However, being American in the United States, within the tripartite relationship, they have very little power. There have been attempts to establish powerful track and field unions, but those unions never really gain any major power because the competition is so fierce in track and field, because you only have 8 lanes, so you are fighting to get your lane, and the only way for you to get a lane is to get a good agent. And that can also be seen in the way track and field athletes remunerate their agents. Track and field athletes are the only athletes that pay their agents the 20% of any contract that they sign. So I think that one way to measure the power of athletes is to see the percentage of their contract that goes to their agent. So for instance, in baseball, a baseball player pays their agent less than 1% of their contract. I mean, you can say, yes, of course their contracts are larger, but in track and field, there are very few professional track and field athletes that can live out of their sport, even though they spend a lot of time training and practicing and competing. So a lot of them have multiple jobs to be able to survive. And of course, there is a serious issue with ethics among agents. And once again, what we observe is that because in the United States, most of agents are lawyers. So they earn their living out of being an agent, but at the same time, they practice their they have a law practice. So I would say that they're very much aware of the possible ethical issues and the danger of them possibly losing their license to practice law. Therefore, they're, I would say, more respectful of certain procedures. I would like to say they have a higher ethical standards in comparison. For instance, if this was my uh, first and most dominant field of study, agents in soccer in Europe. I mean, that is a sport where anybody can become an agent, where criminal groups are involved, where you have somebody gain the license to be an agent in soccer, and then you go to sign a contract, and there's another person that shows up, and that person has nothing to do with the actual agent on the paper that is supposed to be representing the player. So in order to bring more ethical concern, the European Union has decided to force FIFA, to force UEFA to eliminate completely the licensing system and now force each team to communicate to FIFA, first to national federation, then to UEFA, then to FIFA, for each player the name of their agent. And so rapidly, all the other international sports federation attempted to implement their system. However, when I in my studies, I know the names of the athletes that are interviewed, and I know the athletes tell me who their, just to give an example, the athletes tell me who their agent is. So now I go on the website, let's say on the website of NBA to see who is listed as the agent of this particular player, and I see another name. So now in Europe, when it comes in soccer, you see that maybe in 70% of the cases. The same can be said about track and field. So the ethical issue, how can we raise an awareness to this very important question of ethics? It's very difficult because the athletes themselves participate in this process, because athletes would tell me, I don't care how dishonest my agent is, as long as they get me a contract, as long as they get me a spot on the team. I don't care. And actually, the concept of reputation is a very important in professional sports. And while generally the reputation is associated with good morals, good business practices, in sports, it's all the opposite. Actually, the agent that has the good reputation is the agent who is willing to break any law in place so they can guarantee to their player a better contract, illegal transfer of funds, and so on. Do teams have more business loyalty to the agent they're negotiating with? Oh yes, definitely. The teams have show more business loyalty to the agents simply because very often they have a longer relationship with the agents that they may have with potential players. However, this is where we see differences. Players that are and I always go back to the example of soccer, because this is really when we can see all the forms of deviance when it comes to the practice of sports agency be very visible. If you are a very highly sought player, you have power. You get to pretty much decide which team you go to, and you get to negotiate the terms of your contract. But there are very few players who have that power. Now, if you are a player that is I don't like to use this word, but an average player, a player that's not necessarily very much needed for a given club, then you really have to follow the rules of the agent that is going to negotiate your contract. And very often what agents do, they call the teams that they already work for and they say, okay, these are the players that I have to offer. Are you interested? What are you looking for? Oh, well, I'm looking for a goal. Okay, I have a goalie. Okay, tell me, what can your goalie do? Okay, well, or remember, the team will say, oh, remember that we owe you $500,000 for another player. Okay, well, can you give us your goalie pretty much for free? So these are the type of negotiations that happen in the background. Everybody knows about it, but nobody really wants to openly talk about it, because there's this common agreement that it serves the purposes of each party involved. And to me, the major concern is when it comes to young players, particularly in Europe. And I'm French, so I know very, very well the example of French young players aged between 14 and 16 in France. By the age of 16, you already know whether you have a professional contract or not. And very often these young boys are being passed from one team to another. So the professional teams have the mandatory obligation to train young players. So they have to pay for their housing, they live with them, they're separated from their families, they're supposed to go to school. And as a side note, the average educational level of a soccer player in France is 8th grade. So that's a completely different topic. So we have these teams that prepare players for a professional career, but they never become professional because professional teams get players from outside of France. Because they want to be competitive. They get players from other countries in Europe and other countries in the world, and a lot of players from Brazil, actually. So there are a lot of very complex issues involving sports agency. I would definitely say that.
That is fantastic stuff, Adriana. There's so much detail there that I'm just so glad that we were able to get on a recording there, because there's so much with that, especially if you're familiar with North American context, like I think most of the other people on the panel are. The differences are just so stark. What you mentioned there about the age of athletes and the education level of athletes, that is, oh, there's so much there. I'm so glad. And again, I certainly have to encourage you to go watch Adriana's full presentation on our website to get the full details. So Kevin and Maddie, you are next. And we have a question from Andy and we have a question from the Ed board. We'll start with the question from the Ed board first. And again, so within the context of genuine discovery here, I'm going to be asking a rather, or the question submitted is a rather speculative one. But how would recentering or reframing the story of soccer in Brazil using this primary source that you've discovered, how would that change the story of soccer in Brazil, or perhaps the story of soccer more broadly?
I'll start with that one. And Maddie, maybe you can start with the next one when we get to that one, because this is kind of the bigger picture. And I think in some ways we're both still learning. We've read as much as we can get our hands on at this point, and as far as we can tell, the Lander story does represent a sort of rewriting of the history of soccer in Brazil, or its origins, insofar as it's been presented so far. The traditional narrative has it that an Englishman named Charles Miller introduced soccer in Sao Paulo in 1894, where it kind of remained an elite club sport for 5 or 6 or 7 years before it began to kind of trickle out into the countryside. And so the Lander story, bringing soccer to the Granbury School as a missionary, really kind of turns that on its head, which is part of why I was so excited to bring it to a conference with a theme of power at play, because it really is, it's looking at things from two completely different perspectives. We're hoping to find more evidence, more sources that kind of describe what happened next after Lander brought the game. It seems, though, that he just introduced the game amongst his students, who were a combination of freed slaves and some children of the immigrants themselves, and just let them kind of run with it and develop the game themselves. And so this would make it a story of agency among those groups. And Maddie and I have talked a lot about how exciting that would have been, particularly amongst the community of freed slaves, who we can only imagine, the kind of difficulties they would have been going through, and to have a source of empowerment, to say nothing of just kind of fun and, enjoyment, but also, something that they were developing for themselves and kind of creating for themselves, and it spreads across the countryside from there. So that was part of why I was so excited at Maddie's discovery in the archives, without even knowing much about the origins of soccer at that point in Brazil. Um, the thought that this was something that was kind of introduced originally amongst the freedmen and began to spread across the country from there, represents really kind of a rewriting of what we've understood. And I would just add, the timeline, these things are kind of happening simultaneously. But we have not found any mention of the Granbury School and Lander and this, the missionaries introducing soccer in the countryside that early.
And something too that's super interesting is I found a couple of sources. Brazil has a very unique style of gameplay when they play soccer. And a lot of scholars describe it as very fancy footwork. And I found a couple of sources from some freedmen, and they were describing whenever they first started to play the game, they were targeted and they were treated unfairly and they were roughed up a bit. And so they had to be inventive with their style of gameplay and kind of, some sources describe it as almost dancing on the field. And so it's interesting that the style of gameplay that's still known today came out of that narrative.
That is, I mean, again, such a rare moment of discovery there, and I just can't wait to read more from what you were able to pull from that. Yeah, if there's the cultural legacy of samba, if you might have discovered samba football's legacy in Brazil, this is so cool. I mean, it's genuinely cool stuff. I would like to go back to Jessica here, if we could. And Jessica, I'd like to ask about the sort of larger sporting context of women's sport in general, and certainly with the sort of emergence of the sort of player advocate that you see in women's soccer. And the question that we have is regarding, just let me pull up the question real quick. Within the context of the emergence of the women's national soccer team, do you believe that the rising tide of women's athletics in the United States will benefit rugby players equally, or is there perhaps the question's alluding to the fact that maybe there's also an opportunity for one sports profile to be raised at the expense of others? So what are your thoughts on that?
I don't think it'll be at the expense of others. I think, rising tides raise all ships. And one of my participants, said that she felt a connection, not just to other women's rugby players, but to other women athletes, other female athletes around the world, and, doing their part to really combat the male preserve of sport, and through participation of women in sports in general, I believe that we are combating that sacred space. As far as I think women are finding their voice. I think society has changed, is changing. You think about the WNBA generation and those athletes coming into that organization in the mid to early 90s. That was when it first started, right? So these athletes that are there now have always had the NBA as an option, right? So that changes a mindset, that changes a perception that I have value as an athlete. Women can now compete, and they're fighting for the same salaries, right? Hockey, the WNBA, women's soccer, they're all fighting for salaries. But they have these young players have these avenues now to be professionals, and they're seeing how they can use their voice, especially on these national platforms. But that was one of my intentions with being rugby, is it's not a national platform yet, right? We just made it. Rugby sevens just made it to the Olympics in Brazil, and we don't have that same platform yet, but you can still use your voice to make change in your local community. You don't have to have a national stage to use your empowerment skills to make change for others. So I think we have these role models that are televised, and girls can now see themselves in those positions, and that will help them find their voice or their avenues and become the player advocates that the women on these professional leagues have become, these role models for the young players.
Perfect. And just as a quick follow-up to you as well there, and do you notice in terms of your own professional hands-on campus experience, do you see that sort of emergence in athletes on your campuses? Are you noticing a change there?
Yeah, and I think especially in the United States, we also have this changing tide from really sparking from the murder of George Floyd. And really that activism is ramping up in ways that people hadn't been involved previously. I was talking with one of our volleyball players the other day, and she basically said, I can no longer just sit on the sideline. I have to get involved in the conversation. And so you have these athletes who are really stepping forward in ways that they hadn't realized that they had power for. If you think about it, if each of my colleagues on this call think about the number of student athletes that you have on your campuses, right? Like that's a powerful voice if they all came together and had action oriented on any topic. And so I think they're now finding ways to use that voice. And my athletes as well are getting on board and making change in their local communities.
Fantastic stuff. And Jessica, sorry to grill you here, but we'll go one last question. This one's from Andy. It says to Jessica, yesterday we listened to a fascinating distinguished speaker address that spoke to the importance of the coach to athlete mental health. How has the athlete-coach relationship manifested and affected your work at all?
Yeah, so that, there's a lot of different parts, right? Coaches don't show up and just coach anymore. It's not the X's and O's that we were all used to when we played. Coach said, go do this. Okay, coach, you didn't really stop and think about it. You just did it. And now athletes, they want to know why, and they want coaches to care for the entire student, right? We talk a lot about developing students beyond the field. How are they going to be, we want them to be good humans and contributing members of society when they graduate. And it is a lot of the mental health crisis right now that's facing all student athletes and students in general, right? You have this social injustice. You have coaches are now career planners and academic advisors and surrogate parents. And, a lot is put on them over the years and in ways that they aren't necessarily prepared for. Coaches aren't social workers. They now have to manage all of these things that come across their desks or on their fields, and helping those students navigate that can be really challenging unless the coaches are willing to evolve. And I'm sure the presentation was just phenomenal the other day. I know there's a lot of conversations even in our conference about how COVID, you have a pandemic and you have the social injustice and how all of that is impacting, the mental health of our student athletes.
Yeah, what a unique position you are in, sort of as a researcher and as a practitioner in that field. You have a lot of unique insight into that topic exactly. Kevin and Maddie, we have a question from Stacy Lorenz. And it says, Kevin and Maddie, this is a fascinating discovery and a possible addition/challenge to our understanding of Brazilian soccer history. Would there be any way to trace the spread of soccer from Lander's school? I would guess that this would be extremely difficult since this is an informal stage of development, never mind the access to sources. Also, is there any mention of this kind of soccer from below development in the literature in other parts of Brazil? I think you had suggested in your presentation that this did not seem to be happening at the time.
Yeah. So, I mean, Maddie wouldn't be surprised to hear me say that this was one of the things I was really pushing her on as she was working on her senior seminar paper. That next step in terms of sources and evidence, what did happen next after Lander brought that soccer ball and introduced the game. And Stacy's absolutely right. It's hard to find sources that cover that period, and it's hard to even know if the source is there. So it's kind of like looking for a needle in a haystack, but you don't even know if there is a needle in the haystack, So it's going to be tricky to find that next kind of stage in terms of the evidence, but we're really hoping to do that. And there are little bits of evidence here and there, and we've been in touch with the Granbury School and gotten a few things from them to try to flesh out the story a little bit. From our end, we're also probing a little bit more with the Lander family, and there are still members of the family alive and in our community who might have records that they never knew were important for anything. But they might have some kind of details in there. So we're kind of working on both ends of that. And then in terms of the development in other parts of Brazil, yes, that is out there, but it all seems to be happening later. In the literature that is currently out there, it takes a few years for soccer to move out of the big cities, and particularly Sao Paulo, and start to spread through the countryside. So, the
We
story
found
that we're
largely-
telling, yeah, it moves up that timeline. Maddie, go ahead.
Largely, the account is that there was not this kind of development in other regions until around 1903. So it took a while to spread out. And so the fact that we have this several years earlier, hopefully we've really come across something.
And Maddie, do you have any more to say about the sources and the contacts with Granbury and potentially filling in some of those gaps?
I can sort of answer Andy's question a little bit about how large of a figure Lander was. I think in the region, he was a pretty large figure. We found a magazine from the Granbury from like 2008, and the cover is a stained glass window with John Lander on it. And he was very influential in the community while he was there. He started the Boy Scouts and had a large role in that around the area. And as far as Southern Methodist missionaries go, he's one of the more well-known ones. So he had a large role in the region, but as far as the country, I'm not too sure.
That's fantastic. Again, I am so excited to see what you guys are able to pull out of that. That is such a fantastic discovery. And even just discovering the document that you have is already a great first step. And I know you're going to do wonderful things with it. Adriana, we have a question from Kevin. It says, Adriana, it seems like there is a serious issue with ethics among agents if the athletes are having as many issues as they claim. Beyond regulation, do agents operate with expectations of ethical behavior?
Oh, well, generally speaking, they do. In reality, because it is a very competitive profession. Just to be very clear, up to 50% of licensed agents in all sports have no clients. In other words, there are people who prepare for the exercise of this profession, but do not attract athletes. So that is why I believe, and really my findings tend to confirm this, some agents are willing to break the ethical standards and show that they can do anything to get a contract to a player and break all the ethical standards. But once again, I think the ethical issues have to bring us to the general question of ethics in sports. I mean, there are so many forms of deviance in sports. So if agents are being deviant, they cannot, that's what really like to focus all the issues in the context of tripartite relationship, because agents cannot do anything on their own. We have to trace the flow of the money. Who has the money in this tripartite relationship? And that would be the team structure. So agents very often follow the demands or really simply the law of the supply and demand. They follow what the team structure asks them to do. So very often when we have illicit flows of money, when we have illicit form of behavior at every level of sports, whether it is, for instance, in the United States, where it is agents talking to high school players and promising them that they will get them signed to the best university to play basketball for them, and then give a little check to their parents to go on vacation. Well, the money has to come from somebody. That money does not come necessarily from the agent. The money comes sometimes from the college, as certain recent cases have proven, or sometimes that money comes from a professional team or the big sponsors. Just to name a few, the recent legal cases show that Nike and Adidas would contact some agents and tell them, hey, this is how much money we can put in this potential player. So go talk to him and tell him that we will sign him once he graduates from college. But sometimes college, 4 years is a very long period. Sometimes things really don't go that well. So I really think the key is the competition. That competition is always for the commodity that is scarce. What is scarce is the best player. Every team wants the most talented player. As far as the agents go, agents don't necessarily want the most talented player. They want a lot of players, the players that will change teams, because they make money only if players transfer from one team to another. If you are a player that spends 10 years in a given team, and you are a player that does not really attract sponsors, then do you really need an agent? That's what happens in soccer, for instance. We have players who spend 10 years in a given team, and after their fifth year, if they say like, okay, this is my team, they don't have an agent because they don't need an agent. So agents want especially talented players in soccer. The same can be said in American sports, but in American sports, the transfers are very limited because they're very regulated. If we look at soccer, for instance, well, a player can change a team every season, and some of them do that. But that means that every time they change a team, the agent gets 10%. They get 10% of the transfer. So when we hear that such and such switch teams for 100 million of euros, what that means that the agent got a commission of 10 million. But that commission of 10 million does not only go to the agent. Very often, the player also gets a certain sum under the table that is for tax reasons passed as the overall amount of the transfer. So because of the competition, it's very difficult to regulate the professions. It's very difficult to put on the agent the expectations of them. They have to be they have to practice a certain form of ethics when they're not alone in this. They are codependent of the two other actors, which are, of course, the structured team and the player. But because the structured team has the money, and really the structured team has all the power, they are really dependent on what the structured team decides to do.
That's fantastic. And I believe Kevin had a follow-up. Would you like to follow up? And then we have a question from Stacy Lorenz after that.
Yeah. So Adriana, I wasn't surprised at all to hear that some lawyers were behaving unethically. But I was really surprised at the number, though. And I may not remember exactly from your presentation, but 80% or so of the athletes felt like their agents were mistreating them in one way or another. And so the follow-up to that is, I wonder if you take the athletes at their word, based on their responses in your survey, or do they maybe sometimes feel like they were not treated properly, but the agent is actually doing the best they can? And so I think of my own students who might feel like I'm treating them poorly, but I'm doing the best that I can from my own perspective. So I just wondered if you had come at it from that perspective too.
Oh, yes, definitely. I think that the situations where the athletes are exaggerating are very few, because what I can say is that very often, because of my relationship with certain athletes that are interviewed, I also know who their agent is, and I also can follow their career. I can say for sure that, yes, you have been taken advantage of. And then in some other situations, yes, you have a player who believes that they deserve more play time, that they deserve to play in a better team. And then you can say, okay, well, that's your own impression of, like, as you give the example of a student who believes that they deserve an A. Okay, for them, we grade him subjectively, but for us, well, okay, we're being objective. This is why you got an A. So in sports, it's a little bit, especially in team sports, it's a little bit more complex. But for instance, just to take the example of track and field, well, in track and field, if you ran fast, you're going to get a lane, and you may get a sponsorship deal. So we can say, well, your agent can get you a lane, but when it comes to the sponsorship deals, that's when we see the inequalities, because we have athletes just graduating from college, and their agent is capable of getting them six-figure sponsorship deals. And then we have athletes who have won medals at championships and the Olympic Games, and who have been let down by their sponsors. And more specifically, if those athletes are women. You may have heard the case of Allyson Felix, who pretty much was abandoned by Nike, and she has generated millions for Nike. She's the most she's the American track and field athlete that has won the most medals. And she got pregnant, and they say, you know what? You're not competing this year for obvious reasons, because she was pregnant. Well, you know what? We're going to cut you off. So in sports, really everything happens so fast, and it's always, we go back to the basic sociological paradigm. Who do we blame? Do we blame the system, or do we blame the person? And because of the lack of power that athletes have in many sports, and I would like to say in all sports except the three big American sports: basketball, American football, and baseball, including in soccer. Soccer players don't have a lot of power. And we saw that, for instance, when Ronaldo was just abandoned by Real Madrid, because they believed that he cost them too much money. So, okay, we don't want you anymore. And for him, it was like, oh, how dare you? And he found himself in playing in Italy, and good for him, he's performing well. So there are very few sports where the athlete has some real power, where they can say, you know what? I don't want to change. And that's why the idea of free agency only exists in those sports. There's no such a thing as free agency in soccer, for instance. Your contract can be terminated, but if you wish to sign for another team, that team will have to pay a penalty to the team where your contract just finished, but also to all the previous teams where you spend some time. No matter how unhappy you were with those teams, no matter how mistreated you were in those teams. So
That's fantastic. Again, such amazing detail, and worth reflecting on that word free agency, right? I think especially in North American sports, something like, oh yeah, free agency starts on Friday. Free agency is still a very novel concept in many sports. That's so fantastic. Now, Stacy Lorenz has a question. I'll ask him to unmute here, and he can ask himself. And here he is.
Sure. Let's see if I can appear. There we go. So my question is for Jessica, actually. And I'm wondering, and when I talk to my students, one of the things we discuss a lot, both historically and in contemporary times, is about sport as character builder and so forth. And that's definitely, I would argue, has kind of been the foundation of the ideology of modern sport as a whole, for why it's legitimate and amazing and everything. Now, of course, there's a lot of problems with that whole concept. But what I'm wondering about is, I mean, that's obviously part of your look at young female athletes and empowering them and so forth. But one of the things that comes out of that too is the idea of, or the tension or the question of, to what extent does that happen automatically because it's sport and all these great things happen? And to what extent does this have to be an intentional, directed, conscious outcome that a coach, for example, usually a coach, brings to the table? And so I'm just wondering if you could talk about that in the context of your study and your work, about how much of this happens just because it's sport, and how much of this needs to be a consciously directed process.
That's a really great question. And I think first it'll depend on, is it a team sport or is it an individual sport, right? Because there's different elements that you can tease out from both of them. I took the context of rugby. A lot of the literature that I've seen has focused on women in team sports. You get that automatic teamwork, collaboration, all of us working together towards the common goal. But I don't think that participation alone gets you to that empowerment, that automatic character step. I think you can participate and you can have a miserable experience, right? Like they're not necessarily all positive, yay, fun sports, right? We unfortunately have seen a couple instances in the past that have ended traumatically for, student athletes and students and athletes in general. But I think when I was going through and looking at the history of women in sports, I think there's an opportunity to be intentional, right? If we want to think about the conscious raising of how women evolved in the sport, most women don't know about the IAAW and how the NCAA took over the IAAW, and they generally know something about Title IX, but they aren't really clear about the full trajectory. And I think so there's opportunities there to be intentional. I think and that will relate, who's responsible for that was one of my questions that I thought about. I think it depends on the age group, right? If you have a bunch of 8-year-olds, that might be a time to talk with them in larger, broader topics. But I was working with 30-year-olds. So is it a education for 30-year-olds, or are you relying on that coach or that male coach who doesn't necessarily know? And most of my women's experiences, they mostly had men coaching them. So is it the male coach? Is it his responsibility to teach these 30-year-old women about their history, or is that a self process? Is it the responsibility of an administrator? Is it my responsibility within an athletic department to teach that history, to develop those skills? And I think that goes back to the question that we talked about earlier, with so much going on with student athletes expecting so much out of coaches these days. Coaches are almost in a place to help them develop to become better individuals, to take the product that they had, help them as an athlete, help them grow as a person in those 4 years before they graduate. So I think it really depends on where the student athlete is, or the student, excuse me, in their trajectory, right? Is it an 8-year-old? Is it a 15-year-old? Is it a 25-year-old? And who and what are you trying to accomplish? I think at each stage, teamwork looks a little bit different. How you're building teamwork, how you're building collaboration, how you're building risk taking. They all look a little bit different, and who puts the onus on whom at that stage. Stacey, I think you're muted.
Yeah, there's a lot there for you to wrestle with. And I mean, you're also dealing with questions of sort of individual character. You're talking about questions of sort of more community or team building things, but you're also talking about kind of this political awareness and almost activism angle as well. And I mean, I would think that there would probably be some differences there in all of those, the ways that would happen. And I'm also intrigued, maybe just as a bit of a follow-up, you do talk about the differences in sports. And you mentioned individual sports, team sports. You've also talked about contact sports being valuable because of their, sort of automatic challenge to the normal gender conventions within sport. But I'm also struck by, and I mean, you mentioned this a little bit in your talk, was it does seem like there's a lot of basketball players who are very vocal and active. I was just reading a couple things about the WNBA again, and sort of their taking that on. And I know historically there's been, college athletes, the ones that I'm aware of have been often basketball players, women's players, like turning their back on the anthem during the anthem to the flag and so forth. So I don't know if I'm not sure if that's something I would really question. Maybe that's just a coincidence, but can you give us a little bit more on the differences you see there between sports and why?
Well, I think, and I haven't done much research on this, but just from my perspective, I think most of those organizations are comprised of African American and Black women, right? And so they are finding their voice, not finding their voice, they've always had their voice, right? African American women are more disruptors and will challenge more situations than white women, right? So if I play a sport that I have all white teammates, I'm from a higher socioeconomic status, well, that emergency isn't happening to me, so I'm not really going to pay much attention to it, right? But if you have an organization that's predominantly made up of African Americans, they're going to be more vocal because that's their community. I think what you're seeing a shift in now is more white people, more white women are talking about it, and they're willing to step in and step forward into those conversations. And so I think that's the snowball effect of everything that's going on since the murder of George Floyd. So I think more people, more white women are engaging in those conversations in ways that they didn't necessarily previously, because they were coming from a place of privilege and they didn't see themselves needing to get involved. Whereas the African American community, that's their community, and that's the community that is in harm's way right now.
Okay, thank you. That was very interesting. Thank you.
Well, that brings us to just about a full hour. And again, as me and Andy had been talking about earlier, in a usual conference setting, you don't get this much time to actually answer these many questions. You're going to get jammed into that last 15 minutes. And if someone goes long, it ends up being like 8 minutes. So this was a genuinely enjoyable experience. Certainly for I can't speak for everyone else, but I'm sure everyone in attendance right now is applauding you digitally. And we want to thank you all so very much for your presentations, which again are available online. Then anyone can go have a look at the presentations in full. I hope everyone is staying safe, and I want to thank you all again for your participation in this conference. And I wish you all well in your future